You finally try to be yourself. You speak honestly. You act more natural. You stop overthinking every word, and yet afterward you feel exhausted, not relieved, not lighter, just drained. So what's happening? Why does being yourself feel like it costs so much energy? It's confusing at first, because you expect the opposite. You think being real should feel freeing, effortless, natural. But instead, after a conversation, you replay everything. Was I too much? Did I say something wrong? Did they judge me? Even when nothing obviously went wrong, your mind keeps searching. You notice small reactions, a pause, a tone shift, a look, and suddenly, your brain fills in the gaps. Maybe they didn't like it. Maybe you were too honest. Maybe you should have adjusted more. So next time, you hesitate. You go back to filtering yourself again, not because you want to, but because being open felt expensive. Over time, this creates a quiet conflict. You want to be real, but you also want to feel safe. And somehow, those two things don't feel compatible. So you start believing something subtle. Maybe being myself is just too much. But that feeling doesn't come from nowhere. There's a pattern underneath it. What if the problem isn't that you're being yourself, but how your brain interprets what happens afterward? Because the exhaustion you feel isn't coming from authenticity itself. It's coming from what your brain does after you're authentic. You're not drained from being real. You're drained from processing being real, from analyzing it, replaying it, trying to measure how it was received. This is not a personality flaw. It's a learned response. Your brain is trying to protect you from social risk, because at some point, being fully yourself didn't feel completely safe. Maybe it led to judgment, or misunderstanding, or subtle rejection. So now, even when you open up, your brain stays on high alert, and that constant monitoring is what drains you. But to understand why it's so intense, you need to see how your brain is wired for this. Your brain has a system called social evaluation monitoring. It's constantly scanning for how others respond to you, not just what they say, but how they react. Tone, timing, body language. When you're being yourself, this system becomes more active because the stakes feel higher. You're not hiding behind a filtered version. You're exposed. And exposure activates something deeper, the brain's threat detection system, specifically areas like the amygdala. Its job is simple: detect risk, prevent rejection, because from a survival perspective, social rejection used to mean danger. So your brain treats authenticity like a potential risk, not always consciously, but biologically. Here's a simple way to understand it. Imagine your mind as a stage. When you're filtering yourself, you're reading from a script, safe, controlled, predictable. But when you're being yourself, there's no script, and your brain doesn't like unpredictability. So it turns on monitoring mode, watching every reaction, analyzing every detail, trying to answer one question: was that safe? This constant evaluation uses cognitive energy, working memory, attention, emotional processing. So even if the interaction goes well, your brain has already spent a lot. And that's why you feel drained. Not because being yourself is hard, but because your brain is working overtime to make sure it's allowed. And until that changes, the exhaustion continues. You don't fix this by forcing more authenticity. You shift it by reducing the cost your brain attaches to it. What to do? After a conversation, avoid analyzing it right away. Why it works. Replaying activates the brain's error detection system, increasing perceived threat even if nothing is wrong. Real-life example: you talk openly with someone. Instead of reviewing it immediately, you shift your attention to something neutral. What to do? When you notice yourself interpreting reactions, pause and say, "That's just a guess." Why it works. Your brain fills gaps with assumptions. Labeling them reduces their emotional weight. Real-life example: someone responds briefly. Instead of thinking they didn't like me, you recognize it as uncertainty, not fact. 3. Normalize emotional exposure. What to? Remind yourself that feeling slightly uncomfortable after being real is normal. Why it works. This reduces the brain's threat response by reframing discomfort as safe. Real-life example: you feel uneasy after sharing something honest. Instead of resisting it, you accept it as part of the process. What to do? Practice being yourself in smaller moments instead of long interactions. Why it works. Gradual exposure helps the brain update its safety model without overwhelm. Real-life example: you express one honest opinion instead of trying to be fully open the entire time. What to do? Before seeking reactions, ask yourself, did this feel true to me? Why it works. Shifts your brain from external validation to internal referencing. Real-life example: after a conversation, instead of thinking, did they like it, you ask, was I aligned with myself? This all comes down to one idea. You're not drained by authenticity. You're drained by monitoring authenticity. So here's a simple model to remember. The open window. Being yourself is like opening a window. Fresh air comes in, but at first your brain checks, is this safe? If you keep opening and closing it quickly, the system stays sensitive. But if you leave it open gradually, your brain adjusts. It realizes nothing bad is happening, and over time, the monitoring quiets down. You don't need to become a different person to feel less drained. You just need to stop treating your own authenticity like a risk. Because right now, you're not exhausted from being yourself. You're exhausted from watching yourself while being yourself. And that can change, slowly, quietly, with less analysis, less pressure, less need to get it right, until one day, you speak, act, exist, and you don't immediately check how it landed. You just move on. And that's when something shifts, not in how others see you, but in how much energy it takes to simply be there.